Our next speaker is going to be talking about climate change at the turning point and go over the matrix of choices. Anthony Hobley is the Chief Executive Officer of Carbon Tracker. It's a global think tank carrying out analysis focused on what we're focused on here, the impact of the energy transition and capital markets. So without further ado, Anthony.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's wonderful to be here. So thank you to Chip and Sally and everyone else for inviting me over here from London. It's taken me a couple of days to get over the jet lag, but I've found this thoroughly enjoyable. I mean, the breadth and the sort of feeling in this room. So, but I think before I sort of introduce Carbon Tracker and what we do and get into some of our analysis, I think I've done what several other people have done, which is, here we go. Put it at the green one, got it. Let's just remind ourselves of the challenge. How quickly we're burning through the carbon budget. And this is good context because all of Carbon Tracker's work refers back to the carbon budget and how long we have left. And we also know the direction of travel. We have to bend the emissions down. Now, in the financial markets, this whole idea of scenarios and these benchmarks is becoming incredibly important. We're now beginning to talk about scenarios in the financial markets and how to apply those to companies, particularly the fossil fuel companies, and we'll come back to that. But this is the challenge. This is where we need to get to. And I think as we've heard again and again, we are running out of time if we haven't already. But, the good news is the direction of travel, and again, we've picked up on this, is in the right direction. We are now heading in the right direction. We know who the winner is going to be, but the question is, does that winner get across the finishing line in time to deliver a stable climate? It is all about the speed of the transition now. So I was asked to talk about the matrix. Well, I'm actually, and for us, I think it's quite simple. In terms of what I think many of us do, we focus on policy, we focus on civil society and mobilizing civil society, we focus on technology, and there's been a big discussion about technology, and we've touched on investors. But the context of how can investors drive this change? If you think about it, whether you're on the brown side of emissions, every ton of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere has to be financed. That ton of carbon doesn't get burned and put into the atmosphere unless there is money to pay for it. So on the one side of the equation, we have to turn that flow of capital off. On the other side of the equation, we have to turn the flow of capital on for all the alternatives that drive the low carbon transition. So I'm very much going to focus on that investor part of this matrix. How do we mobilize and create a network of investors, shareholders, investment banks, corporate lawyers that are all driving this transition? How do we do that? Now, I've played around. This is not quite the same presentation I brought with me over from London. I've sort of built on this, and my communications people will kill me because I've actually prepared some of my own slides. There was a lot of talk yesterday, if you were here, about raccoons and why, on a news day, the raccoon story was the most popular. Well, I couldn't find a raccoon, but I did find a fat cat. A fat cat might say, and I should care because. And this expression, if you get in the door, if you get past the ESG in a major investment fund or investment bank, this is the expression you will quite often be presented with. You've got probably 2 minutes, maybe less, to get their attention before they quite literally switch off and start checking their email. How do you do that? You've got to translate the climate science, the issue we care about, because quite frankly, whether they care about it in their personal lives, 9 to 5 or probably 9 to 8 p.m., they don't care. They care about risk and return. Now note, I've got a little yoga theme going there. So you've got to translate this issue into a language they understand, their language, the language of the financial markets, and it has got to be in the context of what they do all day, which is assess risk and return. That is critical. If you don't do that, you are not going to get their attention. Now, what is Carbon Tracker most known for? We're known for this concept of the carbon bubble and the stranded asset. And when you see your financial concept become physical, and this is the climate march in 2014, I think, during Climate Week and the UN General Assembly meeting, and you quite literally see NYPD trying to deflate the carbon bubble on the horns of the Merrill Lynch bull, you know perhaps you are getting somewhere. But this was a very basic piece of analysis. Our founder, Mark Campanale, went to 30 philanthropic funders before he got the money to do this very basic piece of research, which in many ways has transformed the way we have this discussion in the financial markets. I remember once he was told by one philanthropic funder, well, if what you are telling us is right, the financial markets should be funding this. Goldman Sachs should be doing this analysis, but they weren't. It was very simple. Took the carbon budget, the amount of carbon we have left to put in the atmosphere and have a 50% or 80% probability, depending which one you use, of staying below 2 degrees, and simply compared it to real-world assets, the oil, gas, and coal reserves and resources out to 2050. And as we know, a massive overhang, a massive disconnect, which we coined the carbon bubble. And then we started talking about the fact that if we do get within a 2 degrees pathway or beyond, effectively most of those oil, gas, and coal reserves and resources are going to be stranded assets. That was the basic concept. And fortuitously for us, a chap called Bill McKibben picked that report up in 2010, 2011, and he wrote his very compelling piece, and if you've not read it, you should read it, Global Warming, Terrifying New Math, in Rolling Stones magazine. That was the spark for the divestment movement in many ways, although whilst we support that movement and what it's doing, we're not advocates of divestment, we advocate engagement, more of that later. And these are the plaudits. The Financial Times, of all the recent ideas climate change campaigners have come up with to convince the world to do more to curb global warming, none has been as potent as the concept of stranded fuel assets. And The Guardian said Carbon Tracker has changed the financial language of climate change. And this is me back in 2014, invited by Ban Ki-moon to present alongside the CEOs of Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Crédit Agricole, etc., at the General Assembly Hall. This is our founder, Mark Campanale, a couple of weekends ago, presenting these concepts to Pope Francis during the meeting with the CEOs of the world's biggest oil and gas companies and financial institutions. So people are listening. So, Paris. The direction is set, and we can't underestimate this. Most of the world's countries, except one, but even that country is doing it at a sub-national level, have signed up, are developing plans. And these really do matter. But again, not enough, not fast enough. We're even seeing action from regulators. Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, we had a lot to do with making that happen, talking about this as a financial stability risk. And investors, the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world, divested from coal, is talking about divesting from oil and gas. BNP Paribas no longer funds shale or shale projects. HSBC has made similar commitments, and so it goes on. But still not enough. And we have your president, the President of the United States. Windmills don't work without subsidies. Now, this immediately made me think of King Canute and everything that Donald Trump is doing to preserve coal. It's as futile, quite frankly, as trying to hold out the tide. Why? Because we're in a paradigm shift. Coal, not renewables, now needs to be subsidized to compete. I'll say that again. I think for anyone who's been in this for any space of time, for anybody who's had that conversation at a dinner party or a party, well, it doesn't renew, it only works if it's subsidized. You can now tell them coal only works if it's subsidized. Our recent piece of analysis, No Country for Coal Gen, we like film titles, or we like to adapt them, showed that in the US alone, there's 104 billion worth of coal-based assets that could be stranded, are likely to be stranded. At the moment, you as US ratepayers, you are paying a premium on your energy bills of approximately $10 billion a year for the privilege of having coal-fired electricity. In some US states, that's 10% of the bill. Why aren't you up in arms about that? Why aren't energy consumers writing and emailing the regulators and saying, aren't you looking after my interests? I could have a cheaper electricity bill if you got rid of that coal. In in Europe, 66% of coal-fired generation is cash flow negative. We are in a paradigm shift. This is the economic tipping point. And I mean, we've heard that over the last couple of days. In the US, by 2021, we think, our financial analysts think, that new wind will be cheaper than existing coal by 2021. So that's to build it and put it in. By 2023, new solar PV will be cheaper than existing coal. So, policy is still important. I take issue with some people who've said that we can do it all through the markets. But the markets and the technology are in the driving seat now because of the economics. But the policy, remember, it's all about speed. The policy's job is to make this happen fast enough to deliver a stable climate. But even if we backslide on the policy, we have showed in recent analysis that even with weak global climate policies by 2050, still, over 70% of world power would come from non-fossil fuels, and more than 65% of world vehicles would be electric. So think what we can do if we make that climate policy strong. Expect the unexpected. So a piece of energy modelling we did with Imperial College in London about the disruptive power of low-carbon technology. So we showed that it is entirely plausible that solar PV could be 23% of global power by 2040 and 29% by 2050. Electric vehicles could be 35% of road transport by 2035 and 66% by 2050. That research actually, particularly on electric vehicles, is beginning to look below the mark with a lot of the recent research coming out. But think what that does on the other side of the equation. That growth eats into demand for oil, gas, and coal. That creates demand destruction and eventually creates peak demand. And the oil and gas companies, they're now talking about peak demand. The big issue between us now is not whether it will happen, but when and how quickly. And just look at history. I mean, technological transitions are nothing new. This is the Easter Day Parade, Fifth Avenue, New York, 13 years apart. 1900, spot the automobile. There is one in there. 1913, a mere 13 years later, spot the horse and carriage. And again, there is one in there, but it's very difficult to spot. These transitions, when they happen, come very fast. And the other thing is the incumbents almost always fail to survive these transitions. We can talk about that a little bit more. And here's Kodak, Blockbuster, steam locomotive manufacturers, typewriter manufacturers. Baldwin was the second biggest steam locomotive manufacturer in the last part of the 19th century, early 20th century. They would be as big then as Shell, BP, Microsoft is today. Their chairman had to defend a major investment in steam locomotive in 1930, and he said, mark my words, steam locomotive will be the dominant form of transport well into the 1980s and beyond. This automobile thing will never catch on. Will history repeat itself? The fossil fuel is lagging. At least publicly, what they're saying is, no, it's going to continue, demand will continue. Our Mind the Gap report says that 1.6 trillion of investment, if it goes ahead, will be stranded. Vehicle tracker. The thing to take away from here is look at the difference between the predictions from the motor manufacturers, 22.1 million vehicles by 2020, and the oil and gas companies, 7 to 8 million. The oil and gas companies are not good at predicting these transitions. The lines along the bottom show the oil and gas industry's predictions of solar growth. The blue line is what actually happened. And that underestimate still continues. They've got better, but it still continues. I won't go into this, but this just shows the drop-off in sales of traditional cameras and Kodak versus the growth. And note when the drop-off started, when sales of digital was still extremely low. And that was roughly when Kodak sold its digital division. So I'm rushing now because I've got 40 seconds left. Disclosure, so I might leave that for Mindy to pick up on in a bit more detail. But this is becoming incredibly important. The reason why we're moving to more company-level analytics, and we've just built a tool that Bloomberg have put out for all their Bloomberg terminals, and we'll be focusing much more on that. just to finish, I think this is important. Peak demand could be as early as 2022, but you see it happens differently for the different fossil fuels and different approaches. We've got to speed that up. I think we can. And to finish, my very last slide, we are moving to apply our macro analytics at the company level because engagement is the new game in town. Divestment has been incredibly successful, but now we've got to engage those companies and put them into runoff. And in terms of networks, we need to create networks of shareholders, and they are doing this. Organizations like Ceres are working with investors to create the CA100 Plus and mobilize those shareholders. And we're going to have analytics-driven engagement. Thank you.